Okay, welcome everyone. We're going to get started because I know we're running a little bit behind schedule already this morning, so I will keep my remarks brief. So I just wanted to welcome everyone here today. Hope that the morning kickoff was inspirational to you and that you got something out of that, that it was interesting to see the governor talking about ChatGPT, so technology focused. So I thought that was wonderful. We're also going to kind of follow on that theme here with talking about electric vehicles. So I would like to introduce our speaker today, Justin Robbins. He's a colleague of mine from HDR, coming from Columbus, Ohio. And I worked with Justin this past summer on the NEVI plan for North Dakota. So we're going to hear a little bit more about that this morning. Please welcome Justin.
Oh, let's see if it works. Good morning, everybody. Like Brenda mentioned, thank you for the introduction, and I'm definitely happy to be here today. She mentioned before I'm coming in from Ohio, and I got to say, when I left, it was about 70 degrees, and it was the warmest February that we've had on record, and this is the second snowfall that I've seen this winter the entire time. And we picked one of our colleagues up from the airport who's coming in from Sacramento, who this is his first time ever seeing snow falling, so it's an exciting time for him as well. We definitely welcome the cold weather and appreciate all that you're doing in that respect. You know, what's funny on the plane too, I sat next to a woman who's at this conference, and I'm scanning the audience to see if she's here. And I mentioned that I was giving a presentation on electric vehicles, and she goes, "I'm going to pepper you with questions at the very end." So I've come prepared to do as much of my homework as I possibly could, anticipating her questions, but we'll see how that goes. So I know we're running a little bit late, and I did offer if the questions start to go south at the end that we could cut this one short, but we'll see how it goes. So as Brenda mentioned before, I've had the opportunity to work with the DOT, and one thing that I do want to say, I work for a company called HDR, and I am not with the DOT. We help them with the plan, and my role here is to basically reflect a lot of the process and the outcomes that we had in that plan, and there might be some specific questions related to North Dakota's process where they're at right now, and those are questions that I may not be able to answer, and the ones that I do have information for, I'd be happy to share, but again, understand that my role is on the consultant side. I wanted to kick it off today and talk a little bit about the growth of the technology and some of the drivers that we're seeing in the marketplace that are really going to impact North Dakota. We recognize that North Dakota is not going to be the leader in EV adoption or EV infrastructure. That's going to be the case in a lot of states as well. But what I can say is that there's a lot of states that are on the opposite side of that coin that represent a significant portion of the market, of the automotive market, that are basically mandating that vehicle sales go fully electric by 2035. And so you look at California, Washington, Massachusetts, New York, Oregon, and Vermont. Those represent almost a quarter of the vehicle sales within the United States. And to the extent that we're looking at a shift in the market, then this might be a significant driver if these requirements stay in place and automotive manufacturers start to really respond to that market. So there's things outside of what we can even do within North Dakota that are really driving the move toward electrification, and this is happening internationally as well. So this is not just within the United States. This is happening in Europe. This is happening in China. This is happening in a lot of the major markets for automobiles right now. On the federal side, what we're seeing right now is there's a requirement that the federal government has to electrify all their non-tactical vehicles by 2027 for light duty, and then 2035, again, non-tactical for medium and heavy duty. Some of the projects that I've gotten the opportunity to work on, a lot of the NEVI plans that we're going to talk about today here in North Dakota, but also the implementation for the NEVI, and then the federal work that we do includes Department of Defense and then the Pentagon as well. So this is real, this is happening in a lot of our federal agencies, and it's a challenge. I'm not going to lie. There are a lot of unanswered questions. There are a lot of things that still need to be figured out, but at the end of the day, we want to be able to anticipate moves in the market and to get to a place where we're essentially building out the infrastructure needed to deploy electric vehicles in these federal facilities. On the funding side, so this is the IIJA, the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. A couple things I did want to mention. So there's $2.5 billion of discretionary funding that's going to be made available. The notice of funding opportunity has yet to come out, but this is really intended for the development of community grant programs throughout the United States. It'll be a competitive program that municipalities and MPOs and state DOTs can chase basically to help support the development of EV infrastructure. There's the $5 billion NEVI program. That's a formula program, and NEVI is the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, and that is, again, the primary focus of this meeting today. States all across the country have all submitted for this program, submitted plans. They've all been approved, and so there's not a state in the union that I'm aware of, at least, that's not proceeding ahead with the development of these fast chargers. There's $5 billion in school bus funding that's been made available as well. And I actually don't know the contours of that program, but I know that school buses are a bit of an easier lift to electrify. So this is something that I think we're going to continue to see into the future. And then there's an additional $5.5 billion of funding through the FTA, the Federal Transit Administration, for their low-no program. And that's to fund bus and bus facilities related to zero and low emissions vehicles and infrastructure. On the technology side, so outside of just policy, the cost of batteries are going down. And so in 2010, the cost for a kilowatt hour of a battery pack, and that's the unit of measurement, right? Consider that kind of like a gallon. The cost for a kilowatt hour for a battery pack was $1,200. In 2022, it's $135. So that's an 88, almost a 90% decrease in the cost per unit capacity of energy for storage in a vehicle. And that's continuing to drop. So outside of any kind of policy, outside of any kind of infrastructure investments, this is the slide I think is really important to absorb, is because as those costs continue to decline, as we get better and better at making batteries, as we get better and better at making battery electric vehicles, and as people continue to adopt them, you're going to continue to see a growth in the market. There are going to be differences. California is going to have a lot more electric vehicles on the road today. Obviously they do. Than North Dakota will, more than Montana, more than South Dakota. There's going to be places in the United States where it's just because of a number of reasons, be it weather, be it the vehicle types that are available, that are not seeing the type of growth that the rest of the country or certain parts of the country are seeing. And I think we're in that spot right now. So we have time. This is not a wave that's cresting right now and something that's going to hit us. We have a lot of time to be able to anticipate the market, see what's happening in other states, try and figure out the best way to do things, learning from their mistakes, learning from what they do best. And I think it's a good position to be in. This is a graph that was done by the Boston Consulting Group. And this shows the different estimates that they've had in adoption of EVs over the course of basically 4 years. And so in 2018, they're looking ahead to 2030. They thought that 21% of the vehicles sold in 2030 would be electric vehicles. And they updated that estimate 2 years later in 2020, and they said, well, we think it'll be 26%. 2021, they thought it would be 42%, and then their most recent estimate, just last year, they're anticipating that 53% of the vehicles sold by the year 2030 will be electric vehicles. Seems like a long way away. That's only 7 years away, and that would be a substantial shift in the market from what we're seeing today. And we don't know exactly what they're going to say for 2023, whether or not they're going to update that estimate. But again, larger market forces, and these are the things that we have to be able to anticipate. On the vehicle side, one of the issues that's been happening is the choice of vehicles has been limited, and that is rapidly expanding. So you can see auto manufacturers, legacy manufacturers such as General Motors. You can see the Cadillac up there. You have Hyundai with the vehicle on the left, Ford F-150 Lightning. You have Volvo and Polestar with another electric vehicle. And again, there's different models that are coming out that while the types of vehicles have been limited as of recently, that's starting to change. And we're starting to see a lot of vehicles that, as I walked through the parking lot here, I saw a lot of trucks. Again, I'm from Ohio, I'm from rural Ohio, and our parking lots look exactly the same. And I think that once those vehicles start to become comparable in terms of range, in terms of abilities to an internal combustion engine, I think that's going to be a decision that a lot of people might start to consider a little bit more than today. I don't think we're there yet. I don't think the technology is quite on par with what you'd see with an internal combustion. There's a lot of limitations to those vehicles right now, but there's no reason to think that it's going to stop. There's no reason to think that they're just going to kind of drop where they're at and walk away. I think we're going to continue to see those vehicles kind of increase in range and sophistication. So I like to give a little primer, at least, in terms of some of the key drivers that we're seeing in the market and try and focus the conversation. One thing I do want to say, I'm not necessarily a proponent of the technology. I think this is where it's going. I think that it's our kind of responsibility as planners, I'm a planner by trade, to make sure that we are responding appropriately, that we are understanding where the market is heading, and that we are setting ourselves up for a future that is hopefully as seamless as possible. And we're not stuck in a spot where people are adopting these vehicles en masse and we don't have the ability to provide the infrastructure, the planning available to support them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about EVs in general. And so I don't know the background of everybody in this room, so I always try and set some benchmarks. There's essentially three types that we would generally call electric vehicles. The first is a hybrid electric vehicle that you can see on the right. That uses just fuel, so that's essentially it's got a small battery. When you brake, it regenerates power and uses it to take off again, to accelerate. You have a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle that are becoming a little more popular. Chevy Volt, for instance, is one. Chrysler offers a minivan. So you can plug it in. It'll charge up. It'll give you about 40 miles of range, typically, on pure EV. And after that, it's got a gas motor that kicks in and essentially acts as a dynamo and generates electricity that powers the car. And then you have a full battery electric vehicle, which is generally the focus of the NEVI program. And those they're not fossil fuel powered at all, at least in terms of the input to the vehicle. And the only way that you can power those is by plugging them in. And this is Tesla. This is the Honda Ioniq or the Ford F-150 Lightning. These are all battery electric vehicles. These will have a range anywhere between 150 and up to 400. I think I saw one now that has a range of up to 500 miles. So they're getting better. They're getting denser at the number of the amount of power that they can pack into those cells. So, these vehicles, again, you have to charge them to operate. Anywhere in cost between $20,000 and $70,000, that's probably a little bit low. I mean, they go up above $100,000. You can buy a new Chevy Bolt with a B, pure battery electric, for about $26,000 MSRP, and the cost is continuing. I think it actually might have increased a little bit, but Tesla came down, so the cost is in fluctuation. And the typical battery range, like I mentioned before, I'll skip over this slide because it basically says the information. So when you go to charge these things, this is where it gets interesting. This is where there's a lot of haze, I guess, not a full understanding of what this is. So level 1 charging, I have a Chevy Volt with a V. That's the one that's got the little battery motor or the gas motor that kicks on. It uses a standard outlet. I can plug it into a 110, 120 volt outlet. It'll take about overnight to charge, and again, I get like 40 miles on that car at the most. Level 2 is what you would generally call destination charging. So that's where it's incorporated into a parking lot. You pull your vehicle up. It uses 20 or 240 volt power, similar to the same type of load or draw that you would get with a dryer, clothes dryer. You can install these in your house, and you can charge a vehicle between 4 to 8 hours, depending on the state of charge. But this is what you would generally see in a parking lot, right? So this is where you're leaving your vehicle for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hours. They're not terribly expensive, and they're not terribly sophisticated either. And then you get to level 3, or what's called DCFC, which is direct current fast charging. These are the big boys. These have the capability to deliver an enormous amount of power. So for example, if our level 1 is 1.9 kilowatts, it's kind of the measurement of power that's being delivered to the vehicle. Level 2 is 19.2 kilowatts, and then level 3 maxes out at 350 kilowatts. So you can see there's kind of an order of magnitude difference in the amount of power that each one of these charging types is able to deliver to the vehicle. And the way I like to, I'm a planner by trade, so this is all for the planners out there. We'll make it as simple as possible. Consider the battery of your car like a swimming pool. Level 1, you're filling it up with a garden hose. Level 2, you're filling it up with a fire hose, and then level 3, you're really filling it up with a fire plug or a fire hydrant, depending on what you call it. So this is, again, kind of an order of magnitude difference. And the NEVI program is all about level 3 charging. This is not community-based charging. This is all about fast charging, high amounts of power, utility coordination, really intended to support long-distance travel across the country. Some of the barriers that we see in terms of EV adoption, range anxiety. This is a rural state. There's cities, there's places that are just difficult to get to with an EV because of the distance. long recharging times. So if you have to drive cross country and you got to make a stop and charge for 8 hours because you only have level 2 available, that's not a viable option for that trip. You don't want to do that. And lack of charging infrastructure. If the charging infrastructure, in the same way that you have a cell phone, I go to somebody's house, I can use their iPhone charger, I plug it in and walk away. I can go to the airport and there's a charger there, I plug it in and walk away. EV infrastructure needs to be kind of to that level in order for it to be completely applicable for day-to-day use and charging. Some of the barriers that we see for EVSE, so that's electric vehicle supply equipment, that's what nerds like me use to basically say EV chargers. Low customer base, so it makes it difficult for people to invest in the infrastructure if there's not a lot of people driving EVs out there. Makes sense. Infrastructure gaps in rural areas and underrepresented communities. Sometimes there's just not the available infrastructure related to power delivery and the sheer quantity of power you have to bring into a site in order to electrify for fast chargers. And then weather and temperature extremes. EVs drop in range. They drop in range when they're against the wind. They drop in range due to temperature. The batteries are less efficient. When you have the heat running, they drop in range. So North Dakota has kind of the perfect atmosphere to make it a difficult area for an EV to operate in. That's not to say you can't. That's not to say that it doesn't fit many people's lifestyles. It may, but it's definitely not a technology that's for every single use case and for every single person that's out there. And we recognize that. When you get to some of the sales projections, this is where it gets interesting across the board. You can see what different manufacturers have started to target in terms of their sales forecasts. So Ford, for example, wants 50% of their annual vehicle sales to be EVs by 2030. GM is looking at 100% by 2035. Chrysler is 35% by 2030. Toyota, 3.5 million by 2030. So all the manufacturers are anticipating that this is going to be a future. Again, looking internationally, this is the direction that transportation seems to be going, the market seems to be going. So they're responding not just to policy within the United States, but also, again, what's happening in Europe and China and making sure that their vehicles have the ability to be purchased there. And I mentioned before, I'll skip over this, but basically EVs are highly efficient, which is great, but it also means they're impacted when you have to use additional power, again, to overcome high speeds or topography or temperature. And at the end of the day, there's going to be an impact. So we recognize that. I'm going to skip over a few slides in the interest of time and get into the meat of our NEVI program. So the NEVI program, it was interesting what happened is as part of this bipartisan infrastructure law, they've basically kind of latched on to an existing program that was already in existence, and that's called the AFC, or Alternative Fuels Corridor Program. That's been going on for about 6 cycles prior to NEVI even being passed. What that is a state can nominate corridors within that state and say, we are pegging this corridor to be an EV corridor. And so it becomes nominated, and then infrastructure gets built out along that corridor, and then it becomes basically a full build-out corridor, whatever that fuel is. Battery electric was one. There's also hydrogen. There's compressed natural gas. There's propane. Number of different fuels that are out there. And so when NEVI came along, they kind of gravitated, they latched onto this program and said, if you have any alternative fuel corridors that have already been nominated, that's what you got to build out with this program. Once you reach build out with those, then you can spend that money off corridor, for example. And that might be an option here, depending on the number of chargers ultimately that get put in and some of the funding potential that you would have from the private sector. So the funds are really intended to support this idea of a national fast charger network across the United States, where every corridor throughout every state that's an interstate has a fast charger that's publicly available. And so potentially you could make a trip from Bismarck down to Columbus, Ohio. Or perhaps at the next conference I'll drive up. Might be a few conferences from now, but we'll see if it's something we can do. But it requires a 20% non-federal match. And I can tell you that most states are basically looking to the private sector to be able to fill that 20%, which means there's not a lot of public dollars outside of the federal funds that are going into this. I think North Dakota is not looking at, right now, any at all of state money to be dedicated toward the program. North Dakota is receiving $25.9 million. It's a 5-year program. So from federal funding year 22 up to 2026, essentially you'll get a certain allotment of funds that get deposited, and you can start to build out the corridors. And the state right now has access to the funds. We submitted the plan. It was approved, and right now the planning process where we try and figure out exactly how this is going to work is underway. That's not one I'm involved with. It's the state DOT that's essentially heading it up right now. So I mentioned before, there's $2.5 billion of the discretionary funding. There's $5 billion in the NEVI federal program. I'll skip over this since I kind of went through that a little bit. Some of the key components of this. So I mentioned before, it has to be level 3 charging, which means super fast charging, right? It has to be located no more than 1 mile from a corridor, and the chargers have to be in operation for a period of no less than 5 years. North Dakota currently has 2 alternative fuels corridors in 94 and 29, and so those corridors essentially are going to get fast charging infrastructure built out over the next 5 years. Now, it's not going to get built out in 5 years, is my guess. We do have some supply chain challenges. There's also 49 other states that are trying to buy the same type of equipment, and so we're going to have some challenges just in terms of getting the infrastructure, and most states will. I think that's just part of the program, so it'll probably be 10 years by the time that we see kind of a network across the United States built out. I do want to say that, again, these are not kind of, I always try and make the joke, not your grandfather's EV chargers. NEVI compliant chargers have to be capable of charging 4 vehicles simultaneously at 150 kilowatts. So you're looking at, per site, 600 kilowatts total, which is kind of the same that you would get with a small grocery store. It's a lot of power. It's not the most power, obviously, but it's a lot to have kind of stretched along the corridors, especially in rural areas. Those are non-proprietary, which means any vehicle can charge there. It uses a CCS system that basically says, it's kind of the standard for shared charging. And those have to be spaced no more than 50 miles apart along those 2 corridors. And so, again, the idea is that starting from Ohio or wherever you're coming from or going to, you can anticipate that there's going to be a network of chargers that are there that can support long-distance travel for EVs across the country, and North Dakota is a component of that. Excuse me. I mentioned before that any funds that are left over after that is considered built out, those actually can be built off corridor, which means you can do non-standard NEVI compliant. You can do smaller chargers off corridor. You can build out in more of your rural areas. Texas, for example, is looking to build out in every county seat once their corridors are fully considered built out. So there's a lot of opportunity that states are really exploring for any excess funds that they have left over. Here's an overall map of the AFC network, so you can get a sense at least of where these corridors are and how states have started to prioritize. This is round 6. There's already been additional corridors that have been nominated, so it's going to be a larger network, and South Dakota has some as well. So I think for round 7 they nominated additional ones, and I think they have at least 2, I want to say. So I mentioned before, overall, there's a potential strategy behind this where, you take the idea of these corridors, 94 and 29, being kind of like buckets, and once those get filled up, once those get filled up, you can start to take that excess funds, take that excess money, and start to spend it off corridor into something a little bit different. It doesn't have to be a NEVI-style charger. It doesn't have to be fast charging in the same way. It can be less power. It can be spaced differently. It can be spaced off corridors. So there's a lot of potential there to do something a little more exciting. When it comes to the state plan development, so this was actually the federal government released the guidance in February of 2022. They required the plans be developed and submitted by August 1st, 2022, which was not a lot of time. I can tell anybody that was on my team working on these, it was a lot of work to get done in a very short amount of time for all 50 states that are out there. Not that we did all 50 states, but everybody was kind of rushing to get these done. The plans themselves, and you can go on the site right now. You just look up North Dakota NEVI plan. You can see how the plan responded to a lot of the requirements that the federal government laid out. So there's things like communications and EV and EV charging infrastructure analysis, and then policy and implementation. Essentially, like, what's the backbone part of this plan? How is North Dakota going to be spending these dollars in a way that meets federal requirements, but also gets North Dakota and the communities that the DOT serves what you want? So try to integrate as much as possible into that program to make it as specific as we could for North Dakota. And I do want to say this is a start, right? This is not going to solve the problems of EVs. This is kind of backbone infrastructure that's intended to support long-distance travel, which again is one of those barriers that we saw. If this doesn't exist, it might make it a difficult proposition for somebody to adopt an EV if they want to. And this program, in my opinion, is really intended to get it to the point where if people do want to adopt that kind of technology, they can, and the infrastructure is there to support long-distance travel. And then the private sector, the private market can come in and start building out the capacity of additional chargers along corridors once there's more EVs in the market and once it makes more kind of financial sense to do it. So again, it kind of positions EVs as a viable option that closes the gap for long-distance travel. It potentially allows greater adoption of EVs for those who want one, making that infrastructure more viable for the private sector to build out, like I say, the chicken and the egg problem, and then gives options for all users in North Dakota for traveling. So again, this is not, the DOT is not pushing this. This is a federal program. All states are doing it, and you know, we're making sure that we meet those federal requirements, but also have the opportunity to craft the program in a way for North Dakota. Some of the questions that generally come up that I want to make sure that I cover. So you'll see there's information packets. There's a booth for from ND DOT. Second floor, and there's some Q&A packets there as well if there's additional information that I didn't cover in this presentation. But these NEVI-funded chargers have to be located outside of public right-of-way. There's a federal requirement that says you are not allowed, essentially, to allow commercial activity within federally funded rest areas. So if the DOT were to build chargers there, then they couldn't charge the electricity. You'd have to give it away for free. Obviously, that's not a position that anybody wants to be in. So this program allows for those public dollars to be spent by the private sector developing infrastructure on private grounds. So we're starting to see a lot of interest from folks like Love's Truck Stop or BP or existing fueling stations really see this as a component of their overall fueling strategy. As I mentioned before, North Dakota is receiving $25.9 million in funding, and that is an 80%, in between 50 and 80% is what we expect that the public funding will go towards. So it'll be a competitive process, and we'll see what the private sector responds with. If they need all 80% to get these built, or if they can do it in a range between 50 and 80, and it'll depend. It'll depend on where they are. It'll depend on kind of how many chargers or charges they anticipate, how many customers they anticipate. So it'll be a range. The DOT will not be owning and operating the chargers. The state government will not be owning and operating the chargers. These will be firmly in the hands of the people who are typically tasked with doing that work. So, you know, kind of legacy charging manufacturers, charging providers are the ones that are going to be operating the equipment, and the DOT is essentially operating as a pass-through of federal funds into the hands of the people who can actually get it done more effectively. Users will pay for the electricity. That's a common question. So electricity use, again, it's a rate that's going to be set by whoever is actually owning and operating the equipment, and the user will pay for the electricity just like the user pays for gas today. It is necessary that North Dakota, so this is a federal requirement, so kind of being forced to participate in the program. At the same time, you're getting $25.9 million to develop EV charging infrastructure, so I think there's a benefit to it as well. And then one thing I did want to mention, I realized that this is an energy-producing state, so the DOT wanted to make it clear that the DOT is energy agnostic. And the approach, again, is to comply with federal programs and regulations when applicable, to tap federal funding when it's available, to save taxpayer dollars whenever possible, and then to prepare for shifts in the industry in the direction that kind of responds to consumer preference. So I just wanted to make that clear that, you know, an electric vehicle, one of the nice things about it is electricity can come from a number of sources. It's not just one place that electricity comes from. It can be coal. It can be natural gas. It can be wind. It can be solar. It can be nuclear. Anything can essentially, if it's an energy source, be turned into electricity. So in that sense, an electric vehicle is energy agnostic. It doesn't really matter where it comes from. And that's one thing to keep in mind as the program gets rolled out. So I feel like I'm running short on time. So I am going to stop. We have a lot more slides that I am going to cut off, and I am going to basically provide up to 10 minutes, I guess, for Q&A. So I did want to ask, I guess, if there's any questions from the audience, I'd be more than happy to attempt to answer them if I can. Now, if I don't get any, I'm just going to keep rambling on, so you may as well ask questions.
Will the contractors have to create parking lots?
So the way that the federal guidance is written, or the federal requirements, is that any component that is necessary in order to build out and charge the infrastructure is an applicable cost. There's differences in that. So right now, what we're anticipating, what we're seeing in the market, and this is not where North Dakota is at right now. From what I understand, the state is still kind of working to figure out the best way to implement the program. And there's a piece of legislation that is going through the House right now in order to allow the administration of that program. If there's a requirement for additional parking to be built, then yes, that could be an applicable cost. I don't foresee, for example, the need necessarily to build additional parking for these chargers. I see the kind of optimal site to be one that is already an automotive use, that they can potentially expand a parking lot or add chargers where additional underutilized parking spaces already are, or in defunct fueling stations. There's a lot of options that are out there, I think, to explore prior to the build out of new pavement. But certainly that could be an applicable cost if it's a need per site. It's going to be on a site-by-site basis. So certain things, you know, if we have to run a line out, if we have to build a new transformer, potentially that's an applicable cost. Things like landscaping, again, that could be an applicable cost. So long as it's part of that overall development of the charger site and it's cohesively part of that experience, then generally what we've seen from FHWA is that would be part of an applicable cost. So the cost of the electricity is going to be dictated, number one, by the utility, number two, by the rate structure that they have that would include demand charges, and then that would be captured by the charging provider. So let's say I open up let's say Brenda opens up her own charging provider. Brenda's charging. So you pull up in your car, and Brenda might charge, let's say, 43 cents per kilowatt hour to charge that vehicle. It's more expensive to use a fast charger, right? To use a very dumb language, it's a big pipe that has to go into that charger to supply that amount of power. So there's a cost to that. Electrify America, which is one of the nationwide charging providers, it's about 43 cents a kilowatt hour is their standard, versus retail here in North Dakota, I think it's around 12 cents a kilowatt hour. So obviously there's a difference. The profit and any additional costs then would be the difference between whatever is sold retail to charge and what they have to recapture in terms of the infrastructure, or the cost of power, or whatever else. So hopefully that answers it. It's a complicated question, and I'm trying to make it as clear as possible while answering it. But essentially, there's different models that charging providers could deploy, and we expect it to be more on the flat fee side, but they could definitely change. Yes. Nope.
Whatever the cost, and then it's, so the 80% is from the state or from the federal?
From the federal government, the 80%. So the way that, and I won't speak on behalf of North Dakota DOT right now. The way that other states are looking at this is kind of a competitive response program. So for example, I have a site that I want to get built out, and I'll show you some of the sites along the corridors. Let's say I want to build a site in Bismarck. So there's going to be one charger that kind of corresponds to one of those sites. You might get multiple applications for that charger. So there's an incentive for those responding to keep the costs low and to keep the percentage, the local match, as high as they possibly can. And that potentially could cover operations and maintenance as well. So at a planning level, some of the numbers that we use are in between $1,500 to $2,000 per kilowatt to develop a charging site. So for a 600 kilowatt site, you're looking at $1.2 million for a charging site. So again, these are not cheap. They're going to fluctuate in cost due to whoever's building them, right? Because you might have companies that are really structured to deliver these efficiently, and they might be able to do it at a much lower cost than a company that does kind of onesie-twosies throughout the state. So we would expect those to be some variability between those costs. Yes? So North Dakota, from what I understand, is a net exporter of electricity. There are conversations that went into the original development of this plan with the utilities that had corridors running through them, and then those conversations continue to happen. So for the NEVI, like the chargers that are here, it's not, it's a lot of power, but it's nothing that the utilities can't handle for the most part. I think the more important question to ask, so vehicles that use fast chargers, they might get 5 to 10% of their charging done with a fast charger, right? It does have some impact on the battery. It's more costly. It's really intended to support long distance travel. So majority of those charging events are going to happen at home. So that might account for 90 to 95% of the electricity usage is charging your vehicle at home. And nice part is a lot of that happens at night. So you have electricity generation that kind of peaks during the day, and you have a lull during the night. So a lot of utilities are looking at this in terms of stabilizing their base load when you have kind of more electricity being consumed for the charging of electric vehicles, so long as it happens at the right time of the day. That's a big question. But generally, and it corresponds to the way that the chargers are oriented too. If you have at-home charging, that'll generally happen at night. If you have like destination charging, like workplace or anywhere else, that will generally happen during the day. So the location matters, and it dictates how people charge and when they charge. I'm sorry? I believe the utilities might be, they understand what's coming, but the DOT is not necessarily involved in the development of power infrastructure. Yes? Yes. Oh, excuse me. I apologize. So she asked if there's a plan in place for the offset of gas tax. So we ran a quick analysis on this. And number one, what's interesting. So right now, North Dakota has a $120 fee that's applied to vehicle registration for EVs. And I'm from Ohio. Ours is like $220. States range across the board. And actually, if you look up, if you go out and pick up this packet, on one of the back sheets of it, we went through and identified all the registration fees and the different approaches that states have used. Because essentially, the state uses gas tax in order to fund infrastructure. If you're not using gas, then all of a sudden that's kind of a shortfall in the state motor fuel tax funds. The analysis that we did basically said that the average vehicle is going to generate less in motor fuel tax than you would receive in the $120 registration fee. So right now, the structure of your, I think it's what, 23 cents a gallon motor fuel tax versus the $120 registration fee, the state is actually looking at a net increase of EVs over internal combustion engines. So right now, at least, the way that it's structured, it's not an issue. The more EVs you get, generally the more funding the state would get. It's not a huge difference. I think it's like $6. Might be up to 14. It's in the packet, but for right now, that's not a huge issue. When we start to look at medium duty, heavy duty, and freight, it'll be an issue. They consume a lot of fuel, and so they account for more than half of the net revenue generated through the motor fuel tax, but they only account for, I want to say, like 20% of the VMT for the state. So, you know, you're looking at a vehicle that might get 5 miles to the gallon versus one that gets 20 miles to the gallon with light duty. So every kind of freight hauler that goes to alternative fuels of fuel, alternative forms of fuel, there's going to be a much higher impact on the state motor fuel tax. Yes, sir. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Right. There are limitations. So the federal requirements dictate that you have to supply 150 kilowatts to 4 vehicles simultaneously throughout the life of the charger. So 24 hours a day. There are some products out there that are really great products, They use a 240 interconnect, and it essentially has a small battery in the charger itself. When you pull up, it's a fast charger for the vehicle, so it can deliver basically DCFC charge to the vehicle. But then when that pulls away, then it takes an additional 4 or 5 hours for that battery to charge back up to discharge again. So those are fantastic for rural areas. Those do not meet the NEVI requirements along the corridors. So we would have to eliminate that as a candidate for the type of infrastructure that's going in. So essentially, as long as it meets the federal requirements, again, 4x150, it has to be open CCS standard. There's a lot of other requirements on the federal side that need to be met as part of that, but there's nothing that says it has to be an X brand of charger. But we want to be able to capture 800 volt architecture, 400 volt architecture, and make sure that it's able to deliver the full capacity of the charger throughout the charging of the vehicle. So anyways, nerd talk basically saying like there's different vehicle types and the chargers have to be able to accommodate all those. The joint office, so the joint office is US DOT, US DOE, and they're the ones that have been tasked with implementing this program. Right now, they've been kind of tight-lipped about it. A lot of the western states, so we did the plan for South Dakota, for North Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, and then we're helping a number of states, including Kentucky and Wyoming, with their NEVI programs and implementation. It's a big issue for rural areas. I mean, the idea that a 4x150 kilowatt charger is going to be heavily utilized in western North Dakota, it would be a more efficient use of federal funds to do 2 chargers, for example. I mean, you get the infrastructure there, and it's a little bit overkill when you're looking at 4 chargers for the amount of VMT we would see passing by there. Right now, the Joint Office hasn't indicated that they're going to be changing that, but that could change. There's places in New Mexico, for instance, that don't even have an interchange within 50 miles of each other. So they're like, what do we do? They don't have an answer. So we found out that the Joint Office is running like 2 weeks ahead of everybody else, trying to figure out a lot of the questions that keep coming up. They have a hard task with them, right? So they're trying to take federal legislation and make it actionable. So I don't envy their position. And I think they recognize the challenges that rural states, especially in the West, are going to be facing with the infrastructure. I also will say that North Dakota's in a good spot because you only have 2 alternative fuels corridors. State of Florida, they nominated every single state highway they could possibly get their hands on, and now they have to build out like 1 million different corridors with the funds, and they're going to have no opportunity to basically build it off corridor versus North Dakota you can, assuming that the funding works out. So you'll have that opportunity. I mean, you can build chargers in other areas, assuming that the 2 corridors are deemed built out. So.
All right, I think we should probably break there.
Probably
Thank
break
you for
there.
the question. I just wanted to clarify, though, once the corridors are built out, then they can go to those different kind of the battery chargers
Yep.
elsewhere in rural areas. So that
Absolutely.
is an opportunity once that those corridors are filled. So
Yes.
it's good. So if we could give Justin a warm round of applause. And if you have additional questions, I know Justin is going to be here for the rest of the day, so I'm sure he'd be happy to answer them. I believe we're breaking for lunch, so there we go. Thanks for
All right,
coming.
thank you.